Welcome back to the deep dive. It is Wednesday, February 11th, 2026. If you were with us last week, you'll remember the metaphor we landed on for the Russian economy.
We did. We said the engine wasn't just overheating anymore, it was seizing up.
Exactly. The radiator blew, steam everywhere. Well, based on data that's dropped in just the last few days, we need to update that.
Oh, yeah.
If last week was the engine seizing, this week is when the tow truck drops the car at the mechanics and he walks over, wiping the grease off his hands, and just hands you the bill.
And looking at these numbers, that bill is astronomical.
It really is. And that's our theme today, the cost of illusion.
Mm-hmm.
We're looking at Russia and China, two powers posting these, shiny numbers on the surface.
Right. GDP targets, huge foreign exchange reserves.
But when you pop the hood, the machinery inside is just grinding itself to dust.
It really is a tale of two different kinds of dysfunction.
So here's the roadmap. First, Russia's wallet. The January deficit numbers are in, and they are, frankly, shocking.
And we'll get into why their oil revenues have just collapsed.
Then the human cost. That VAT hike and the low unemployment number we talked about last week, they're actually massive red flags.
Mm-hmm. And we'll touch on the EU's 20th sanctions package. They're going after something new. The shadow fleet.
Finally, we pivot to China. New inflation data proves that silent crisis we mentioned. It's getting a lot louder. So let's start with Russia. The check engine light is off because the whole car is on fire. What's the update?
Well, the Ministry of Finance dropped the January numbers on February 6th.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're in the Kremlin, this is the spreadsheet you've been dreading.
Okay.
In one single month, the federal deficit hit her 1.718 trillion rubles.
1.7 trillion in, 31 days?
In 31 days. To put that in perspective, that is almost 0.7% of their entire annual GDP.
Wow. Wiped out in the first month of the year.
It's a hemorrhage. And the cause is exactly what we thought it would be. It's oil.
Right, the lifeblood. We knew the sanctions and the price caps were supposed to hurt, but what do the numbers actually say?
The numbers are brutal. Oil and gas revenues for January, 393 billion rubles.
Which sounds like a lot until
you compare it to January of 2025. It's roughly half.
Half. They lost 50% of their energy revenue year over year.
Correct. And that is the money that pays for the war.
But hold on, I'm confused. Because we see the shipping data, the tankers are still moving, they're still physically selling a ton of oil. How does the revenue get cut in half?
That's the key. It's not about volume, it's about leverage. 2 years ago, Russia could sell to anyone. Europe, the U.S., Asia.
They had options.
They had options. Now the West is closed off. They really only have two big customers left, India and China.
And those customers know they're the only game in town.
Exactly. It's a buyer's market. So an Indian refiner can look at Moscow and say, look, we know you're desperate. We want a 30% discount.
So they're moving barrels for pennies on the dollar.
It's even worse than that. They're moving barrels at a higher cost for pennies on the dollar. They have to pay for that shadow fleet of tankers, higher insurance.
So it's a margin crisis. The profit is being squeezed from both ends.
Precisely.
Yep.
Low sale price, high delivery cost.
Yeah.
And all the while, their war spending is going through the roof.
Which leaves a massive hole in the budget. That 1.7 trillion ruble hole. So how'd they plug it?
Well, you go where the money is, you check the citizens' pockets. We're seeing a hike in the value-added tax, the VAT, from 20% to 22%.
Okay, let's talk about that. A 2% hike doesn't sound world-ending. Why is this such a big deal?
Because a VAT is what we call a regressive tax. It's a consumption tax.
Meaning it hits the poor much harder than the rich.
Exactly. If you're buying a yacht, 2% is nothing. But if you're a pensioner, that 2% is on everything. Milk, bread, your heating bill.
It's a tax on just existing.
It literally takes food off the table for the lowest earners. And they're doing this while inflation is already a huge problem.
Which is a perfect segue. We have new numbers on that disconnect between official inflation and what people feel.
We do. And the gap is getting wider. The official CPI number implies an annual rate of about 6.5%.
Which is high, but maybe manageable.
Right. But the Bank of Russia did their own survey of what people expect inflation to be, what they feel in their wallets.
And that number is?
13.7%.
Double. The government says 6, the people feel 14.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And in economics, expectation drives reality. People are panicking. Consumer confidence is just evaporating.
And that brings me back to the unemployment number. I have to ask again. It's down to 2.2%. Why is that a disaster?
Because it's a sign of a dying demographic, not a booming economy. We call it a war distortion.
Break that down for me.
The labor market is tight, but it's not because new businesses are hiring. It's because hundreds of thousands of men are at the front. and hundreds of thousands of educated people have just left the country.
So you have a labor shortage, not labor demand.
You've got it. So if you're trying to run a bakery in Moscow, you can't find a baker. He's either in a trench or he's fled to Georgia.
And the local tank factory will pay triple what you can offer.
And that just kills the civilian market. It's cannibalizing the rest of the economy to feed the war. It keeps you warm for a night, but eventually the whole house collapses.
So that's the internal pressure. What about the external sanctions?
It was a pretty quiet week from the US and UK, mostly just administrative cleanup.
But the EU?
The EU is making moves. They're working on their 20th sanctions package. And they're not just adding names to a list. They're going after the plumbing of the system.
Oh, plumbing.
The logistics. First, the shadow fleet. They're blacklisting another 43 of those rusty, uninsured tankers Russia uses.
Okay.
But the really clever part is this new focus on third country enforcement.
What does that mean? They're going after ports in, what, Indonesia and Georgia? I see Kalivi and Karaman mentioned.
Think of it like this. Those shadow fleet tankers are old. They break down. They need pit stops for repairs and refueling. Those ports are the pit stops.
And the EU is now telling those ports.
They're saying, if you service that Russian tanker, we will sanction your port. We will cut you off from far more valuable Western trade.
So it's not about stopping the ships. It's about making the journey so incredibly expensive.
That it eats away whatever tiny profit margin they had left. It all comes back to that 1.7 trillion ruble deficit. This is why it exists.
The noose tightens. Okay, let's pivot east. If Russia is the engine that's burning too hot, China is the one that's frozen solid.
The silent crisis.
On the surface, they look fantastic. Foreign exchange reserves are up to, what, $3.4 trillion? The yuan is strong.
It's a very convincing facade, but those reserves are a buffer. They're not an engine. The real story is in the new inflation data.
Let's hear it.
The Consumer Price Index, CPI, was up only 0.2% year over year. Barely moving.
Almost zero.
But the really scary number is the Producer Price Index, the PPI. That's what factories charge for goods. It was down 1.4%.
Negative. So factory prices are actually falling. Why is that so bad? It sounds good for consumers.
It sounds good until you realize why they're falling. It's because factories are sitting on mountains of stuff they can't sell.
It's a fire sale.
A desperate one. It's proof of a massive overcapacity problem. They have all this supply, but domestic demand is just too weak to buy it all.
And when factories have to cut prices, the next thing they cut is
wages.
Yeah.
And then jobs. Which means people have even less money to spend, so factories have to cut prices again.
the deflationary spiral.
It's economic quicksand. And it's the perfect mirror image of Russia's problem. Russia is overheating, too much demand, high inflation. China is freezing too much supply, falling prices.
Which brings up the obvious question. They have $3.4 trillion sitting there. Why not just spend some of it to fix the problem?
That's the policy paralysis. The reserves look good for stability. It shows they aren't going broke. But it doesn't fix the core issue, which is confidence. Businesses are afraid to invest, and households are afraid to spend.
So they're just stuck. Managed stagnation.
That's the term. They're keeping the ship afloat, but the engine's been off for a long time.
Let's bring this together. You have Russia running a high fever, burning through its savings, taxing its own people into poverty just to keep the war machine running.
A model of pure extraction for short-term survival.
And then you have China, this glittering exterior with trillions in the bank, but a hollowed-out interior where nobody is buying anything and prices are falling.
A model of paralysis and deep structural imbalance.
It makes you wonder. We spend so much time analyzing their strength, but maybe the real story here is their fragility.
I think so. Economic gravity always wins.
So I want to leave our listeners with this thought. We see Russia cannibalizing its economy to survive. It's burning too hot. We see China paralyzed by its refusal to empower its own people. It's growing too cold. The question is, which type of economic failure breaks first? The one that explodes from pressure or the one that simply freezes to death?
And which one does more damage to the rest of the world when it finally cracks? That's the really scary question.
That is the question. Thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive.
See you next time.